At the end of the Sui dynasty, the empire that had once reunified China after centuries of division was already rotting from the inside. Emperor Wen of Sui, the founder of the dynasty, had ruled with discipline and restraint, but his death marked a turning point that the state would never recover from. His son, Yang Guang, seized the throne and became Emperor Yang of Sui, remembered in history as Sui Yangdi, a ruler whose ambition far exceeded the endurance of his people. From the very beginning of his reign, the machinery of the state was driven at an unsustainable pace, and every lever of power was pulled to extract more labor, more taxes, and more obedience from a population already stretched thin. Sui Yangdi launched massive construction projects that reshaped the physical landscape of the empire. The Grand Canal, linking the northern political centers with the fertile south, was an engineering achievement of historic scale, but it was built on the backs of millions of conscripted laborers. At the same time, palaces, roads, and military installations consumed enormous resources. These projects were not temporary burdens. They became a permanent drain on the countryside, forcing peasants away from their land and into endless cycles of state labor. Famine and displacement followed wherever imperial commands reached, and resentment spread far faster than official proclamations. Compounding these domestic pressures were costly and largely unsuccessful military campaigns. Sui Yangdi sought glory on the battlefield, especially against the Korean kingdom of Goguryeo. These expeditions required vast armies and immense logistical support, yet they ended in repeated failure. Soldiers died not only in combat, but from hunger, disease, and exhaustion. Entire regions were stripped of able-bodied men, leaving farms untended and families broken. Each defeat undermined the aura of imperial authority, transforming fear into anger and obedience into defiance. By the second decade of the 7th century, the empire was dotted with rebel bands, local warlords, and former officials who no longer believed the Sui court could command loyalty. What began as isolated uprisings gradually merged into a broader collapse of central control. Grain convoys were intercepted, tax collectors were attacked, and imperial decrees were openly ignored. The Sui state still existed in name, but its grip on reality was slipping away. Amid this chaos stood Li Yuan, a powerful aristocrat with deep military experience and strong family connections. He served as the governor of Taiyuan, a strategically vital city in the north. Officially, Li Yuan remained loyal to the Sui court, but he understood that the dynasty was nearing its end. His position placed him at the crossroads of opportunity and danger. Remaining passive could mean destruction if rival factions moved against him, while acting too early could brand him a traitor without sufficient support. Li Yuan's second son, Li Shimin, played a decisive role in pushing the family toward action. Unlike his father, who hesitated and weighed every risk, Li Shimin was bold, perceptive, and deeply aware of the shifting balance of power. He recognized that the collapse of the Sui was not a distant possibility but an unfolding reality. Rebel leaders were already carving out territories, and whoever seized the capital would gain legitimacy in the eyes of officials and commoners alike. In the year 617, Li Yuan made his move. Marching south from Taiyuan, he advanced toward Chang'an, the imperial capital. Crucially, he did not present himself as a rebel seeking to overthrow the dynasty. Instead, he claimed to act in the name of the Sui, declaring that his goal was to restore order and protect the realm from chaos. This political framing was essential. It reassured officials who feared total collapse and appealed to a population exhausted by violence but still attached to the idea of imperial continuity. Upon entering Chang'an, Li Yuan installed a young Sui prince as a figurehead emperor, while he himself assumed the role of regent. This maneuver allowed him to consolidate power without immediately provoking resistance from those still loyal to the Sui name. At the same time, he issued a set of policies designed to win popular support. These measures, often summarized as the reduction of taxes, the easing of labor obligations, and the restoration of legal fairness, were a sharp contrast to the excesses of the previous reign. For people who had known only relentless extraction, even modest relief felt transformative. Meanwhile, the Sui Emperor Sui Yangdi remained alive but increasingly isolated. His authority was confined to a shrinking circle of courtiers and soldiers, and his inability to suppress the growing rebellion sealed his fate. In the year 618, he was assassinated by his own guards. With his death, the last thread holding the Sui dynasty together snapped completely. There was no longer any pretense of restoration. The old order was gone. Later that same year, Li Yuan formally ascended the throne, proclaiming the founding of a new dynasty. He took the reign title Emperor Gaozu of Tang. The Tang Dynasty was born not in a moment of triumph, but in the aftermath of systemic collapse. Its legitimacy rested on a promise that it would learn from the failures of the Sui and govern with restraint, competence, and moral authority. Yet the establishment of the Tang did not mean peace. Large parts of the empire remained under the control of rival warlords, rebel leaders, and former Sui generals who had no intention of submitting to the new regime. The state existed on paper, but unity had to be achieved through force. Once again, Li Shimin emerged as the central figure in this struggle. Commanding Tang armies, he led campaigns against powerful opponents, defeating them one by one and steadily expanding the reach of the new dynasty. These early years defined the character of Tang rule. The dynasty was forged in warfare, political calculation, and the careful management of legitimacy. The leadership understood that brute force alone would not be enough. Officials had to be persuaded, the military had to be rewarded, and the population had to be convinced that this new order was fundamentally different from the one that had failed them. By the end of the founding phase, the Tang Dynasty stood as the strongest claimant to authority in China. It had inherited the administrative framework of the Sui, but it was still searching for stability. Beneath the surface of consolidation lay unresolved tensions, especially within the imperial family itself. Power had been seized through cooperation, but it would soon be tested by rivalry. The same forces that had elevated the Tang were already setting the stage for the conflicts to come. With the Tang Dynasty formally established, Emperor Gaozu faced a reality far harsher than the ceremonial image of a new reign might suggest. The empire was unified in name, but in practice it remained fractured, scarred by years of rebellion and distrust. Former Sui generals, regional strongmen, and self-proclaimed kings still controlled vast territories. Many of them had survived the fall of the Sui by adapting quickly, switching loyalties when convenient, and maintaining private armies loyal only to themselves. The Tang court in Chang'an could issue edicts, but its authority stopped wherever these warlords chose to resist. In these early years, Emperor Gaozu ruled as a cautious consolidator rather than a triumphant conqueror. His priority was survival. He relied heavily on experienced officials who understood the administrative machinery inherited from the Sui, while carefully avoiding policies that might reignite mass unrest. Taxes were moderated, corvée labor was reduced where possible, and legal codes were simplified to restore a sense of order. These measures helped stabilize the heartland, but they did little to solve the military problem that loomed over the dynasty. That responsibility fell increasingly on Li Shimin. As the second son of the emperor, he held no automatic claim to the throne, yet his battlefield successes quickly made him indispensable. He was appointed Prince of Qin and given command of Tang forces tasked with eliminating rival regimes. His campaigns were relentless, strategic, and often decisive. Unlike many generals of the era, Li Shimin combined speed with diplomacy, offering leniency to defeated opponents who surrendered early while crushing those who resisted to the end. One of the most formidable adversaries was Wang Shichong, who controlled Luoyang and proclaimed himself emperor of a short-lived Zheng state. Luoyang, the eastern capital, was symbolically and strategically crucial. Whoever held it could claim continuity with earlier dynasties and dominate the central plains. Li Shimin personally led Tang forces against Wang Shichong, laying siege to the city and cutting off its supply lines. The campaign was long and brutal, but it ended with Wang's defeat and execution, a turning point that signaled Tang's supremacy in the east. Almost simultaneously, Li Shimin faced another powerful rival, Du Jiande, who ruled a large territory in the north and initially appeared unstoppable. Rather than confronting Du Jiande directly on open ground, Li Shimin employed patience and calculated restraint. He allowed tensions between rival factions to deepen, then struck when conditions favored the Tang. The decisive victory over Du Jiande removed one of the last major obstacles to unification and cemented Li Shimin's reputation as the most capable military leader of the dynasty. Each victory expanded Tang territory and legitimacy, but it also shifted the internal balance of power within the imperial family. Li Shimin's elder brother, Li Jiancheng, was the designated crown prince. By tradition and law, he was the heir apparent, supported by their youngest brother, Li Yuanji. Yet neither could match Li Shimin's achievements. While Li Jiancheng remained at court, overseeing rituals and administration, Li Shimin returned repeatedly from the battlefield as a celebrated hero. Soldiers admired him, generals respected him, and officials increasingly looked to him as the true pillar of the dynasty. This imbalance bred suspicion and fear. Li Jiancheng understood that military success translated into political capital, and Li Shimin possessed far more of it than any other member of the royal family. Rumors spread through the palace that Li Shimin harbored ambitions beyond loyal service. Whether these rumors were exaggerated or deliberately cultivated by rivals, they poisoned relations among the brothers. Court politics became a silent battlefield, with alliances forming and dissolving behind closed doors. Emperor Gaozu found himself trapped between gratitude and anxiety. He owed the survival of the dynasty to Li Shimin's victories, yet he also feared that rewarding his second son too generously would undermine the authority of the crown prince. Attempts to balance power through titles and honors only deepened resentment. Li Shimin was given high rank and influence, but not succession. Li Jiancheng retained his position as heir, but lacked the prestige needed to command universal loyalty. As tensions rose, both sides began to prepare for the worst. Li Jiancheng and Li Yuanji strengthened their networks within the palace guard and sought to limit Li Shimin's access to the emperor. They accused him of plotting rebellion and urged their father to remove him from military command. Li Shimin, for his part, became increasingly isolated, aware that his enemies were closing ranks. What had once been a shared struggle to build a dynasty was turning into a zero-sum contest for survival. Meanwhile, the empire itself remained fragile. Although major rivals had been defeated, smaller uprisings continued to flare across the countryside. Bandit groups, disbanded soldiers, and desperate peasants tested the authority of the Tang state. Every internal conflict within the imperial family threatened to weaken the dynasty's ability to respond. Stability required unity at the top, yet unity was precisely what was unraveling. The contradiction at the heart of early Tang rule became impossible to ignore. The dynasty had been forged through violence and decisive action, but now sought legitimacy through order and hierarchy. Li Shimin embodied the former, Li Jiancheng the latter. Each represented a different vision of how power should be exercised, and neither could fully coexist with the other. The court's attempts to suppress this conflict only drove it underground, where it grew more dangerous with each passing month. By the mid-620s, the Tang Dynasty stood at a crossroads. Externally, it had achieved what seemed impossible only a few years earlier: the reunification of China after the collapse of the Sui. Internally, however, it was approaching a crisis that would determine its future character. The question was no longer whether the Tang could rule the empire, but who would rule the Tang itself. All signs pointed toward an inevitable reckoning. The same forces that had elevated Li Shimin through war were now threatening to consume the imperial family from within. The capital of Chang'an appeared calm, its institutions functioning and its rituals intact. But beneath that surface lay fear, ambition, and calculation. The stage was set for a moment that would define not only the fate of the Tang Dynasty, but the very meaning of imperial power in China. By the year 626, the tension within the Tang imperial family had reached a point where compromise was no longer possible. What had begun as rivalry shaped by unequal achievements had hardened into a struggle for survival. Li Shimin, Prince of Qin, understood that his military victories had made him indispensable to the dynasty, but they had also marked him as a threat in the eyes of his elder brother, Crown Prince Li Jiancheng, and their younger brother, Li Yuanji. At court, whispers of conspiracy replaced open discussion, and every gesture was interpreted as preparation for betrayal. Li Jiancheng still held the legal advantage. As crown prince, he controlled the palace bureaucracy and enjoyed proximity to Emperor Gaozu. Li Yuanji supported him with fierce loyalty and influence over key military units stationed near the capital. Together, they worked to isolate Li Shimin, accusing him of plotting rebellion and urging their father to strip him of command. Several times, Emperor Gaozu considered these accusations seriously. The emperor was aging, weary of conflict, and desperate to preserve order within his family. Yet every attempt to discipline Li Shimin risked weakening the very military foundation that sustained the Tang state. Li Shimin was not blind to the danger. He knew that precedent in Chinese imperial history was unforgiving. Brothers who lost power struggles rarely survived to enjoy quiet retirement. Reports reached him that Li Jiancheng and Li Yuanji were tightening their grip on the palace guards and planning to strike first. Whether these reports were exaggerated or accurate mattered less than their plausibility. In an atmosphere poisoned by suspicion, hesitation itself could be fatal. The capital city of Chang'an became the silent stage for an approaching catastrophe. Outwardly, court life continued as usual. Officials attended audiences, memorials were submitted, and rituals followed established forms. In private, however, alliances were tested, loyalties bought, and contingencies prepared. Both factions understood that whoever acted decisively would likely prevail, while delay would invite annihilation. The breaking point came in the summer of 626. Li Jiancheng and Li Yuanji were scheduled to enter the palace through the Xuanwu Gate, one of the northern entrances to the imperial compound, to attend a court meeting. Li Shimin, convinced that this was the moment when his rivals intended to eliminate him, chose to act first. The decision was irreversible. If he failed, he would be branded a traitor and destroyed along with his supporters. If he succeeded, the moral stain of fratricide would follow him forever. At dawn, Li Shimin positioned loyal troops near the Xuanwu Gate. The plan was precise and brutal in its simplicity. When Li Jiancheng and Li Yuanji arrived, they would be cut down before they could react. As the brothers entered the gate, the ambush was sprung. Arrows flew at close range, and chaos erupted within the narrow passage. Li Jiancheng was struck and killed almost immediately. Li Yuanji attempted to fight back but was quickly overwhelmed and slain. The clash was brief, but its consequences were immense. News of the killing spread rapidly through the palace. Guards loyal to Li Jiancheng were neutralized, and control of the capital shifted within hours. Emperor Gaozu was confronted with a fait accompli. 2 of his sons were dead, and the survivor commanded the military forces capable of enforcing order. Faced with the reality of power rather than the ideals of succession, the emperor had little choice. Within days, Li Shimin was named crown prince. Shortly thereafter, Emperor Gaozu abdicated the throne in his favor. Li Shimin ascended as Emperor Taizong of Tang. The dynasty had crossed a threshold that could not be undone. The Tang state now rested on the authority of a ruler who had secured power through violence within his own family, an act that both stabilized the regime and cast a long moral shadow over his reign. As emperor, Taizong moved quickly to consolidate legitimacy. He ordered the restoration of order in the capital and reassured officials that the foundations of governance would remain intact. He emphasized continuity, presenting the events at Xuanwu Gate as a tragic but necessary step to prevent greater chaos. Rituals were performed to honor the dead, and proclamations stressed unity and the greater good of the empire. Taizong also demonstrated political skill in dealing with those who had supported his rivals. Rather than launching a broad purge, he selectively punished key figures while extending clemency to many others. This approach reduced the risk of rebellion and signaled that the new emperor valued stability over revenge. By balancing firmness with restraint, he transformed a violent seizure of power into a functioning government. At the same time, Taizong reflected deeply on the lessons of recent events. He recognized that unchecked ambition, whether his own or that of others, could destroy even the strongest dynasty. Determined not to repeat the excesses that had doomed the Sui, he sought counsel from capable officials and encouraged frank criticism. He believed that an emperor must listen, even when the truth was uncomfortable, if the state was to endure. Under Taizong's leadership, the Tang court began to take on a distinct character. Merit and competence were emphasized over hereditary privilege, at least in principle. Military commanders were rewarded but kept under close supervision. Civil officials were empowered to debate policy, creating a culture of governance that valued reasoned argument. These reforms did not erase the memory of bloodshed at Xuanwu Gate, but they laid the groundwork for a period of effective rule. The empire itself responded positively to the new emperor's policies. Agricultural recovery accelerated, tax systems were rationalized, and local administration became more predictable. While challenges remained, especially along the frontiers, the sense of existential crisis that had marked the dynasty's early years began to fade. For the first time since the fall of the Sui, China appeared to be governed by a regime capable of long-term stability. Yet the legacy of Xuanwu Gate could not be fully contained. It established a precedent that power, once contested, could be resolved only through decisive and often violent action. Future generations would remember Taizong both as a wise ruler and as a man who secured his throne through the deaths of his brothers. This dual image would shape how later emperors understood authority and fear. The Tang Dynasty had survived its most dangerous internal test. Through the bloodshed of 626, it emerged with a ruler whose vision and capability would define an era. The question that remained was whether the balance Taizong achieved between strength and restraint could be maintained by those who followed him. The answer would determine whether the Tang legacy would endure as an age of order or unravel once more under the weight of human ambition. With his position secured, Emperor Taizong of Tang turned his attention from survival to governance. The violence that had brought him to power weighed heavily on his conscience, and he was acutely aware that legitimacy could not rest on force alone. If the Tang Dynasty was to endure, it needed a system of rule that corrected the failures of the Sui while channeling the strength that had unified the empire. From this determination emerged what later generations would call the Zhenguan era, a period remembered as one of disciplined governance, political clarity, and institutional reform. Taizong understood that the downfall of the Sui had not been caused solely by military defeat, but by the exhaustion of the people. Excessive taxation, endless labor conscription, and the arrogance of unchecked authority had hollowed out the state. Learning from this example, he made restraint a guiding principle of his reign. Taxes were carefully regulated, and corvée labor demands were reduced to levels that the agricultural population could realistically sustain. By allowing peasants to return to their fields and rebuild their livelihoods, the state restored its most fundamental source of strength. Central to Taizong's vision was the belief that an emperor must be willing to listen. Unlike many rulers who surrounded themselves with flatterers, he actively encouraged criticism from his ministers. Officials were expected not only to carry out orders, but to challenge policies they believed harmful. This culture of open remonstrance became a defining feature of the early Tang court. Taizong famously stated that honest criticism was like a mirror, allowing a ruler to see his own faults clearly. Without such mirrors, he believed, even a capable emperor would drift toward disaster. One of the most influential figures in shaping this political culture was Wei Zheng, a former supporter of Taizong's enemies who was nevertheless retained and elevated for his integrity. Wei Zheng spoke bluntly, often reminding the emperor of the dangers of ambition and excess. Rather than punishing such candor, Taizong valued it, setting a powerful example for the bureaucracy. This relationship demonstrated that loyalty to the state mattered more than loyalty to a faction, reinforcing merit as the foundation of governance. Administratively, Taizong strengthened the systems inherited from the Sui rather than dismantling them. The centralized bureaucracy was refined, with clearer divisions of responsibility and improved oversight. Legal codes were revised to emphasize consistency and proportionality, reducing arbitrary punishment and restoring public trust in the justice system. These reforms did not eliminate corruption entirely, but they created standards against which abuses could be judged and corrected. Military power remained essential, yet Taizong was careful to keep it subordinate to civilian authority. Generals who had won great victories were rewarded, but they were not allowed to accumulate independent power bases. Rotations of command, strict reporting requirements, and close supervision prevented the emergence of warlords within the Tang system. This balance ensured that the army served the state rather than competing with it, a lesson drawn directly from the chaos that followed the Sui collapse. Beyond internal governance, Taizong pursued an active and confident foreign policy. Tang armies pushed outward, securing borders and projecting influence across Central Asia. Diplomatic missions flowed between Chang'an and neighboring states, and the Tang court became a hub of international exchange. This expansion was not merely territorial, but cultural, as ideas, technologies, and religions moved along the trade routes that converged on the empire. The Tang state presented itself as a model of order and sophistication, attracting admiration as well as submission. Despite these successes, Taizong remained wary of complacency. He frequently reflected on history, studying the rise and fall of earlier dynasties to understand the patterns of imperial decline. He recognized that prosperity itself carried risks. When the state functioned smoothly and resources flowed abundantly, rulers were tempted to indulge personal desires and ignore warning signs. Determined to avoid this fate, he imposed limits on court expenditure and discouraged extravagance, particularly within the imperial household. The Zhenguan era also saw efforts to integrate diverse populations into the Tang system. Ethnic groups along the frontiers were managed through a combination of military pressure and administrative inclusion. Local leaders were recognized and incorporated into the imperial hierarchy, binding them to the dynasty through shared interests. This approach reduced the likelihood of constant rebellion and expanded the Tang conception of rule beyond narrow ethnic lines. Over time, the cumulative effect of these policies became visible. Agricultural output increased, trade flourished, and population levels recovered from the devastation of the late Sui years. Roads and canals were maintained rather than endlessly expanded, prioritizing sustainability over spectacle. The capital of Chang'an grew into one of the largest and most vibrant cities in the world, reflecting the stability of the state it housed. Yet even at the height of his success, Taizong never fully escaped the shadow of his own rise to power. The memory of Xuanwu Gate lingered as a reminder of how quickly family bonds and moral norms could collapse under political pressure. This awareness fueled his determination to govern justly, but it also underscored a deeper truth about imperial rule. Stability depended not only on laws and institutions, but on the character of the ruler himself. As Taizong aged, the question of succession began to loom. The very principles he had promoted, merit, discipline, and restraint, would soon be tested by the next generation. For the moment, however, the Tang Dynasty stood on firm ground. The Zhenguan era had transformed a fragile regime born from civil war into a functioning empire with a coherent vision of rule. This period would later be remembered as a benchmark against which all subsequent Tang emperors were measured. It demonstrated that power seized through violence could, under the right leadership, be converted into order and prosperity. At the same time, it offered a cautionary lesson that even the strongest systems depended on constant vigilance. The achievements of Emperor Taizong did not guarantee eternal stability, but they provided the Tang Dynasty with its most solid foundation. The stability achieved under Emperor Taizong did not eliminate the underlying tensions of imperial rule, and after his death, the Tang court entered a period of transition marked by shifting alliances and fragile authority. His successors inherited a powerful state, but they also inherited a system in which proximity to the throne could translate into immense influence. It was within this environment that Wu Zetian emerged, a figure whose ascent would fundamentally alter the political landscape of the dynasty and challenge long-held assumptions about power, gender, and legitimacy. Wu Zetian first entered the imperial palace as a concubine of Emperor Taizong. At that stage, her position was modest, and few could have predicted her future dominance. After Taizong's death, she followed established custom and entered a Buddhist convent, seemingly removed from political life. Yet fate and ambition soon intersected. Emperor Gaozong, Taizong's son and successor, brought her back to the palace, where she quickly regained favor. Her intelligence, composure, and ability to navigate court politics set her apart in an environment defined by rivalry and intrigue. As Emperor Gaozong's health declined, Wu Zetian's influence grew steadily. She became empress consort and increasingly assumed responsibility for state affairs. Memorials passed through her hands, appointments reflected her preferences, and decisions were shaped by her judgment. At first, her authority was exercised behind the scenes, cloaked in the language of service to the emperor. Over time, however, the distinction between assisting the throne and controlling it became increasingly blurred. Wu Zetian understood that power at court depended not only on proximity to the ruler, but on control of information and institutions. She cultivated loyal officials, rewarded those who supported her rise, and removed potential rivals through calculated accusations. The mechanisms she employed were ruthless but effective. Networks of informants monitored the bureaucracy, and charges of disloyalty or conspiracy were used to eliminate opposition. Fear became a tool of governance, ensuring compliance even among those who privately resented her authority. Following Emperor Gaozong's death, Wu Zetian ruled as Empress Dowager on behalf of her sons. In theory, the Tang Dynasty continued under male emperors. In practice, real power rested entirely in her hands. This arrangement allowed her to consolidate authority while maintaining a veneer of continuity. Yet, it also intensified resistance among conservative elites, who viewed her dominance as a violation of Confucian norms. For them, the idea of a woman exercising supreme power was fundamentally illegitimate, regardless of her competence. Rather than retreat in the face of opposition, Wu Zetian advanced further. In the year 690, she took an unprecedented step and proclaimed herself emperor, establishing a new Zhou dynasty. This act marked the first and only time in Chinese history that a woman officially assumed the title of emperor. By doing so, she stripped away any remaining ambiguity about her rule. Power was no longer exercised indirectly. It was claimed openly and without apology. Wu Zetian justified her reign through a combination of symbolism, religion, and political reform. She promoted Buddhism as a source of moral authority, commissioning texts that portrayed her as a divinely sanctioned ruler. These narratives were disseminated widely, reinforcing the idea that her rule was not an aberration but a fulfillment of cosmic order. At the same time, she implemented policies designed to broaden the base of the state. The civil service examination system was expanded, allowing individuals of lower aristocratic background to enter government. This shift weakened entrenched elites and created a class of officials whose loyalty was tied directly to her patronage. Despite the harshness of her methods, Wu Zetian was not solely a tyrant driven by paranoia. She demonstrated administrative skill and an understanding of statecraft. Agricultural production was encouraged, local governance was monitored closely, and the empire remained largely stable during her reign. Trade continued along established routes, and the Tang legacy of cosmopolitan exchange persisted under her rule. These achievements complicated later historical judgments, which often struggled to reconcile her effectiveness with the brutality of her political tactics. One of the most notable figures during this period was Di Renji, a senior official known for his integrity and moderation. Di Renji served Wu Zetian with loyalty, while also advocating restraint and fairness. His presence illustrated that even within a climate of fear, principled governance could survive. Wu Zetian's willingness to listen to Di Renji at critical moments suggested that her rule was not governed solely by suspicion, but also by pragmatism. Nevertheless, the cost of her consolidation was high. The constant threat of accusation eroded trust within the bureaucracy. Officials learned to prioritize survival over initiative, and genuine debate became risky. While the state functioned, it did so under a shadow of anxiety that would have lasting effects on political culture. The memory of this period reinforced the association between centralized power and repression, shaping how later rulers approached dissent. As Wu Zetian aged, the question of succession resurfaced. Without a clear and widely accepted plan, the stability of her regime depended increasingly on her personal authority. Court factions maneuvered to position themselves for the inevitable transition, and the tension between Zhou and Tang loyalists intensified. Eventually, in the year 705, Wu Zetian was forced to abdicate. The Tang Dynasty was restored under Emperor Zhongzong, bringing her extraordinary reign to an end. Wu Zetian died later that same year, leaving behind a legacy that defied simple classification. She had ruled with unmatched authority, challenged entrenched norms, and reshaped the political structure of the empire. At the same time, her reliance on surveillance and purges exposed the dangers inherent in concentrated power. For the Tang Dynasty, her reign represented both continuity and rupture, preserving imperial strength while altering its moral framework. The period following her abdication did not immediately resolve these contradictions. The court remained divided, and the memory of her rule continued to influence political behavior. Yet the state she left behind was intact, capable of recovery and renewal. Wu Zetian had demonstrated that the Tang system could survive even the most radical transformation, but she had also revealed how fragile legitimacy could be when tradition and authority collided. After the abdication of Wu Zetian and the formal restoration of the Tang Dynasty, the imperial court entered a period of cautious recovery. Emperor Zhongzong returned to the throne, symbolizing continuity with the past, but real authority remained contested among powerful factions. The scars left by years of political purges and centralized control did not heal quickly. Trust within the bureaucracy was fragile, and the balance between imperial authority and ministerial influence had yet to be clearly redefined. The dynasty had survived an unprecedented experiment in rule, but it now faced the challenge of re-establishing stability without repeating earlier excesses. Zhongzong's reign was short and marked by internal struggle. Court politics revolved around rival clans, particularly the influence of Empress Wei and her relatives, who attempted to replicate aspects of Wu Zetian's dominance without possessing her political skill. This imbalance created renewed instability, culminating in another violent intervention within the palace. In the year 710, a coup led by Li Longji, the grandson of Emperor Gaozong, reshaped the succession once again. With decisive action, Li Longji eliminated Empress Wei's faction and placed his father on the throne as Emperor Ruizong. Although Emperor Ruizong ruled briefly, the true center of power had already shifted. Li Longji emerged as the dominant political figure, commanding loyalty from key military units and enjoying broad support among officials eager for decisive leadership. In the year 712, Ruizong abdicated, and Li Longji ascended the throne as Emperor Xuanzong of Tang. His accession marked the beginning of one of the most celebrated periods in Chinese imperial history. At the start of his reign, Emperor Xuanzong embodied the ideal of a reform-minded ruler. He was energetic, disciplined, and deeply conscious of historical precedent. Having witnessed the dangers of factionalism and unchecked ambition, he sought to restore balance to the Tang state. His early policies emphasized efficiency, accountability, and moral restraint. Corruption was punished, administrative procedures were streamlined, and capable officials were promoted, regardless of factional affiliation. These measures reassured a bureaucracy weary of instability and signaled a renewed commitment to orderly governance. This phase of Xuanzong's rule became known as the Kaiyuan era, a time remembered for prosperity and effective administration. Agricultural output expanded as land registration systems were improved and tax burdens were rationalized. The state ensured that farmers retained enough resources to sustain production, reinforcing the economic foundation of the empire. With rural stability restored, population levels rose, and internal markets flourished. These developments strengthened state revenues without resorting to coercive extraction. Trade also played a crucial role in the resurgence of Tang power. Chang'an stood at the heart of a vast network connecting East Asia with Central Asia, the Middle East, and beyond. Merchants from distant regions brought goods, ideas, and technologies, contributing to a cosmopolitan culture unmatched by any contemporary capital. The Tang court welcomed this exchange, recognizing that openness enhanced both economic vitality and imperial prestige. Under Xuanzong's early leadership, the empire projected confidence rather than insecurity. Culturally, the Kaiyuan era represented a high point of artistic and intellectual life. Poetry, painting, music, and scholarship thrived under imperial patronage. The court supported education and the refinement of the civil service examination system, reinforcing merit as a principle of governance. Officials were expected not only to administer effectively but to embody cultural ideals that reflected the dynasty's values. This integration of culture and politics strengthened the legitimacy of the state in the eyes of the elite. Militarily, Xuanzong initially maintained the careful balance established by his predecessors. The army remained essential to border security, particularly along the northern and western frontiers, yet it was kept under close supervision. Generals were rotated, and their authority was limited by administrative oversight. This approach prevented the emergence of independent warlords, while ensuring that the empire could respond quickly to external threats. For a time, the system worked as intended. However, the very success of the Kaiyuan era planted the seeds of future weakness. As stability became routine and prosperity normalized, vigilance declined. Xuanzong, once tireless in his attention to state affairs, gradually withdrew from daily administration. He entrusted increasing authority to trusted ministers and court favorites, believing that the system he had perfected could sustain itself. This confidence was not entirely misplaced, but it underestimated the corrosive effects of complacency. Within the bureaucracy, the incentive structure began to shift. Officials learned that maintaining favor could be as important as effective governance. Debate, once encouraged, became more cautious. While corruption did not explode overnight, subtle distortions accumulated, eroding the standards established during the early years of reform. The emperor's reduced engagement created space for intermediaries to shape policy and control access to power. At the same time, the military structure evolved in ways that would later prove dangerous. To manage vast frontier regions more efficiently, the Tang state relied increasingly on regional military governors, known as jidushi. These commanders were granted extensive authority over troops, finances, and local administration. In the short term, this arrangement enhanced border security and reduced the burden on the central government. In the long term, it concentrated power in the hands of individuals whose loyalty was not always guaranteed. Despite these emerging risks, the Tang dynasty under early Xuanzong appeared stronger than ever. The empire was wealthy, culturally vibrant, and widely admired. Few contemporaries could imagine that such a system might collapse within a single generation. The memory of earlier turmoil faded, replaced by confidence in imperial resilience. History, however, had shown repeatedly that prosperity could be as destabilizing as crisis if it dulled a ruler's awareness. As Xuanzong aged, personal preferences began to shape political reality. The court grew more insular, and emotional attachments increasingly influenced decisions of state. The balance between public duty and private indulgence shifted almost imperceptibly. What had once been a disciplined administration gradually transformed into a court defined by luxury and favoritism. The Kaiyuan era thus stands as both the pinnacle of Tang achievement and the beginning of its gradual decline. It demonstrated what the dynasty could accomplish under focused and principled leadership, while also revealing how easily those gains could be undermined. The structures that sustained prosperity required constant attention, and without it, their strengths could become vulnerabilities. By the end of this phase, the Tang dynasty remained powerful, but the conditions that would later lead to catastrophe were already taking shape beneath the surface. The empire had reached its height, and from that height, the path forward would prove far more perilous than anyone at court was prepared to admit. As Emperor Xuanzong withdrew further from the daily burdens of governance, the center of gravity within the Tang court shifted decisively toward personal relationships and court favor. What had once been a system driven by discipline and institutional balance increasingly revolved around access to the emperor himself. This transformation did not occur suddenly, nor was it initially perceived as dangerous. It emerged gradually, shaped by comfort, routine, and the belief that the prosperity of the Kaiyuan era was permanent. At the heart of this change was Yang Yuhuan, later known to history as Yang Guifei. She entered the palace under unusual circumstances, eventually becoming Xuanzong's most favored consort. Her beauty, charm, and emotional connection to the emperor were legendary even in her own time. Xuanzong, now aging and weary, found in her companionship a retreat from the pressures of rule. The court atmosphere followed his lead. Ritual seriousness gave way to indulgence, and the emperor's personal happiness became an increasingly visible priority of state life. Yang Guifei herself did not directly administer the empire, but her presence altered the political environment in profound ways. Favor flowed outward from her position, benefiting members of her family and those aligned with them. Chief among these beneficiaries was her cousin, Yang Guozhong. Through palace connections rather than administrative achievement, Yang Guozhong rose rapidly through the ranks until he became chief minister. His ascent symbolized a broader shift in Tang politics, where proximity to power mattered more than competence or restraint. As chief minister, Yang Guozhong wielded immense influence over appointments, fiscal policy, and court access. His leadership style was abrasive and self-serving, alienating many experienced officials. Critics accused him of corruption, incompetence, and reckless ambition. Rather than addressing these concerns, Yang Guozhong relied on the emperor's favor and the protection afforded by his familial tie to Yang Guifei. The result was a court increasingly divided between those who benefited from this arrangement and those who feared its consequences. The emperor's detachment amplified these problems. Xuanzong trusted Yang Guozhong and dismissed warnings from ministers who urged caution. Over time, the culture of frank remonstrance that had defined earlier Tang governance eroded. Officials learned that criticism could end careers rather than correct policy. Silence and compliance became safer than honesty, weakening the state's capacity for self-correction. While the court indulged in luxury and intrigue, the military structure of the empire continued to evolve. The system of regional military governors, the jidushi, had expanded steadily over previous decades. These commanders were responsible for defending frontier regions and maintaining internal security, and they possessed authority over troops, finances, and local administration. In theory, they remained servants of the central government. In practice, many operated with considerable autonomy. Among these commanders, none was more powerful or more dangerous than An Lushan. Of mixed Sogdian and Turkic background, An Lushan rose through the ranks as a frontier general, commanding forces in the northeast. He was skilled, charismatic, and adept at cultivating patronage. An Lushan also understood court politics. He presented himself as loyal to Emperor Xuanzong while exploiting rivalries within the capital to strengthen his own position. An Lushan cultivated a close relationship with Yang Guifei, whom he publicly addressed as a maternal figure, a gesture that amused the emperor and reinforced his image as a devoted servant of the dynasty. This calculated familiarity granted him access and protection. At the same time, An Lushan amassed unprecedented military power, controlling 3 major frontier commands and commanding hundreds of thousands of troops. His forces were loyal to him personally, bound by rewards and shared identity rather than allegiance to the Tang state. Tensions between An Lushan and Yang Guozhong escalated as each viewed the other as an existential threat. Yang Guozhong recognized the danger posed by An Lushan's power and repeatedly urged the emperor to curb or remove him. An Lushan, in turn, accused Yang Guozhong of corruption and incompetence, portraying himself as the defender of imperial interests against a decadent court. Xuanzong, caught between these rival narratives, hesitated. His reluctance to act decisively reflected both his declining engagement and his desire to preserve personal harmony. The court became paralyzed by factional struggle. Decisions were delayed, warnings ignored, and compromises substituted for action. And Lushan continued to strengthen his forces, while Yang Guozhong tightened his grip on central administration. Each move by one side intensified the resolve of the other. The emperor's failure to resolve the conflict allowed it to mature into open hostility. Beyond the palace, the broader social environment was deteriorating. Although the empire remained wealthy on paper, disparities widened. Frontier soldiers endured harsh conditions, while court life grew increasingly extravagant. Taxes and requisitions, though not yet unbearable, felt unjust when contrasted with visible luxury in Chang'an. Discontent simmered among both civilians and soldiers, creating fertile ground for rebellion. And Lushan understood this mood and exploited it skillfully. He presented himself as a champion of order against corruption, claiming to act in defense of the emperor rather than against him. His rhetoric blurred the line between loyalty and ambition, making it difficult for contemporaries to distinguish genuine concern from calculated deception. By the time his intentions became unmistakable, his power base was already secure. The emperor's isolation deepened as warnings multiplied. Officials urged him to recognize the scale of the threat, but their voices carried less weight than they once had. Xuanzong's trust in familiar faces and established routines dulled his perception of danger. The very stability that had defined his early reign now worked against him, fostering a false sense of security. By the mid-750s, the Tang Dynasty stood on the edge of catastrophe. The combination of court decadence, unchecked favoritism, and militarized regional authority had created a volatile system. All that remained was a spark. The confrontation between An Lushan and the central government was no longer a question of if, but when. The empire that had reached its zenith under the Kaiyuan era was now vulnerable in ways that few fully grasped. Power had drifted away from institutions toward individuals, and loyalty had fragmented along personal and regional lines. The stage was set for a rebellion that would shatter the illusion of invincibility and expose the true cost of complacency at the highest level of rule. The rebellion that had been gathering momentum beneath the surface finally erupted in the year 755, shattering the fragile equilibrium of the Tang Dynasty. And Lushan, no longer content to maneuver within the boundaries of court politics, openly rose in revolt. From his power base in the northeast, he declared that he was acting to purge corruption and protect the emperor, a claim that cloaked naked ambition in the language of loyalty. The deception was thin, but it was effective enough to confuse officials and delay a unified response. Within weeks, the empire was plunged into its gravest crisis since the fall of the Sui. And Lushan's forces moved with alarming speed. Commanding seasoned troops loyal to him personally, he advanced southward along critical routes, overwhelming local defenses. Cities fell in rapid succession, not always through prolonged siege, but often through betrayal or panic. Many local commanders, uncertain of the court's resolve and fearful of An Lushan's reputation, chose surrender over resistance. The rebellion spread like a fracture through brittle stone, exposing how hollow central authority had become. By the time the gravity of the situation was fully understood in Chang'an, it was already too late to contain the uprising at the borders. Court debates turned frantic, yet decisive action remained elusive. Yang Guozhong, still chief minister, attempted to assert control, but lacked both credibility and military expertise. His rivalry with An Lushan had paralyzed earlier responses, and now his presence only intensified confusion. Emperor Xuanzong, confronted with the consequences of years of inaction, struggled to impose coherence on a collapsing system. The advance of rebel forces toward the capital triggered widespread fear. Chang'an, long a symbol of imperial stability and cultural brilliance, suddenly appeared vulnerable. Supplies dwindled as transport routes were disrupted, and rumors of impending massacre spread among the population. The court fractured into factions, arguing over strategy, responsibility, and blame. In this atmosphere of desperation, the emperor made a decision that would mark the emotional nadir of his reign. As rebel armies closed in, Xuanzong fled Chang'an, abandoning the capital to its fate. The imperial procession moved southwest toward Sichuan, seeking safety in the mountainous regions beyond immediate reach of the rebellion. This flight, though strategically understandable, carried immense symbolic weight. The emperor's departure signaled to the empire that the center could no longer hold. Confidence in the dynasty collapsed almost overnight. The journey itself became a crucible of rage and despair. Imperial guards, exhausted, underpaid, and enraged by the disasters unfolding around them, turned their fury on those they believed responsible. At Maowei, the escorting troops mutinied, demanding the execution of Yang Guozhong. They accused him of corruption and mismanagement, holding him accountable for the catastrophe. Xuanzong, powerless to resist, watched as his chief minister was killed. The soldiers' anger did not end there. They insisted that Yang Guifei, as the symbol of court indulgence and favoritism, must also die. For Xuanzong, this demand struck at the core of his personal life. Yang Guifei had been his companion, his refuge from the burdens of rule. Yet the logic of survival left him no choice. Under immense pressure, he ordered her death. She was executed at Maowei, a moment that would echo through Chinese history as a symbol of how private desire and public responsibility had fatally collided. The flight continued, but the moral authority of the emperor had been irreparably damaged. Soon afterward, Xuanzong abdicated in favor of his son, who ascended the throne as Emperor Suzong. This transition, carried out amid chaos, reflected the desperate need for a ruler who could rally resistance. Xuanzong retired, a broken figure, haunted by loss and regret, while the fate of the dynasty rested on a new generation. Emperor Suzong faced an empire in ruins. Rebel forces controlled vast territories, including the eastern capital of Luoyang, which An Lushan proclaimed as the seat of a new Yan regime. The rebellion fractured the administrative system, disrupted agriculture, and displaced millions of civilians. Entire regions were stripped bare as armies marched back and forth, requisitioning food and labor. Famine and disease followed in the wake of military devastation. To counter this existential threat, Suzong adopted extraordinary measures. He sought assistance from external allies, including forces from Central Asia, whose cavalry played a critical role in counteroffensives. Loyal Tang generals, among them Guo Ziyi, emerged as pivotal figures, coordinating complex campaigns to reclaim lost territory. These efforts required enormous resources and political compromise, but they gradually shifted the balance. Meanwhile, the rebellion itself began to fracture. An Lushan, increasingly paranoid and brutal, alienated his own followers. In the year 757, he was assassinated by his son, An Qingshu. The leadership of the rebellion passed through several hands, each succession weakening cohesion and morale. Internal rivalries eroded the rebel cause even as Tang forces regrouped. By the year 757, Tang armies retook Chang'an and Luoyang, delivering a psychological blow to the rebels. Yet victory was far from complete. Fighting continued across the north for several more years, draining the empire's strength. When the rebellion was finally suppressed in the year 763, the Tang Dynasty still stood, but it was profoundly transformed. The cost of survival was staggering. Population losses were immense, with millions dead or displaced. The fiscal foundation of the state was shattered, forcing reliance on emergency measures and concessions to military commanders. The authority of the central government, though restored in form, was weakened in substance. Regional powers that had played decisive roles in defeating the rebellion now expected autonomy as their reward. The An Lushan rebellion marked a definitive turning point. It exposed the fatal consequences of complacency, favoritism, and unchecked military authority. It also revealed the resilience of the Tang system, capable of mobilizing vast resources in the face of annihilation. Yet the balance between center and periphery had shifted irreversibly. For Emperor Xuanzong, the rebellion defined his legacy. Once celebrated as the architect of a golden age, he would be remembered equally for presiding over its collapse. His retreat into seclusion contrasted starkly with the suffering of the empire he had ruled. For the Tang Dynasty, the rebellion was both an end and a beginning, closing the era of unquestioned supremacy and opening a prolonged struggle for survival. In the aftermath, the illusion of imperial invincibility was gone. The dynasty endured, but the world it governed had changed. Power had dispersed, loyalty had fractured, and the scars of rebellion would shape politics for generations. The Tang had survived its greatest trial, yet the price of survival would continue to rise, setting the stage for a long and troubled decline. The suppression of the An Lushan rebellion did not restore the Tang dynasty to its former strength. Instead, it ushered in a prolonged period of instability in which the empire survived in name but struggled in practice. The devastation left by years of warfare had hollowed out the economic and administrative foundations of the state. Vast tracts of farmland lay abandoned, irrigation systems were damaged, and millions of people had been killed or displaced. The central government faced the immense task of reconstruction with resources that were no longer sufficient to meet the scale of the crisis. One of the most enduring consequences of the rebellion was the transformation of the military system. In order to defeat the rebels, the Tang court had relied heavily on regional military governors, granting them extensive autonomy over troops, taxation, and local administration. After the war, these commanders retained their power. Known as jidushi, they ruled their territories like personal domains, maintaining private armies and collecting revenue largely independent of the central treasury. While they continued to acknowledge the emperor in ritual terms, their loyalty was conditional and often transactional. The imperial court in Chang'an lacked both the strength and the unity to reverse this decentralization. Attempts to curtail the authority of powerful jidushi risked renewed rebellion, while tolerating their autonomy undermined the very concept of centralized rule. As a result, the Tang state drifted into a fragile equilibrium in which the emperor's authority depended on negotiation rather than command. This shift marked a fundamental departure from the political order established during the dynasty's early centuries. Alongside the rise of regional militarism came the growing dominance of palace eunuchs. In the aftermath of the rebellion, emperors increasingly relied on eunuchs to counterbalance the power of military governors and civilian officials alike. Eunuchs controlled access to the emperor, commanded elite palace troops, and intervened directly in matters of succession. Their influence expanded precisely because they were perceived as personal servants of the throne rather than representatives of rival factions. Over time, this reliance produced unintended consequences. Eunuchs used their proximity to the emperor to manipulate appointments, eliminate opponents, and enrich themselves. Emperors who attempted to resist their influence often found themselves isolated or deposed. The court became a battleground where eunuchs, officials, and military commanders competed for control, each weakening the others while eroding the authority of the state as a whole. Efforts at reform emerged periodically, driven by officials who recognized the dangers of fragmentation. These reformers sought to restore fiscal stability, reduce military autonomy, and revive effective administration. However, their initiatives faced fierce resistance from entrenched interests. Without a strong and unified imperial backing, reforms were either diluted or abandoned altogether. The memory of the An Lushan rebellion loomed large, discouraging decisive action that might provoke another catastrophic conflict. The social fabric of the empire continued to deteriorate. Heavy taxation, imposed to fund military expenditures and court expenses, placed immense pressure on the peasantry. Local officials, operating with minimal oversight, often abused their authority to extract additional resources. For many rural communities, survival became increasingly precarious. Natural disasters, including floods and droughts, compounded these hardships, leaving large segments of the population vulnerable to starvation. As conditions worsened, banditry and unrest spread across the countryside. Displaced soldiers and desperate farmers formed armed groups, challenging local authorities and disrupting trade routes. These disturbances were often treated as isolated security issues, but together they reflected a deeper structural failure. The state could no longer guarantee protection or justice in vast regions of the empire, undermining its legitimacy among the people. At court, succession crises became frequent and destabilizing. Emperors rose and fell with alarming speed, often at the behest of eunuch factions. Assassinations, forced abdications, and puppet rulers became recurring features of late Tang politics. Each episode further weakened confidence in imperial authority and reinforced the perception that the throne was a prize to be seized rather than an institution to be respected. Despite these challenges, the Tang Dynasty displayed remarkable resilience. Cultural and intellectual life continued to flourish, even as political power fragmented. Poetry, philosophy, and religious practice provided outlets for expression and reflection in a world marked by uncertainty. This cultural vitality preserved the Tang legacy in memory, even as the reality of governance grew increasingly dysfunctional. The contrast between cultural brilliance and political decay defined the post-rebellion era. On the surface, the empire retained its grandeur, rituals, and historical prestige. Beneath that surface, however, the mechanisms of control were steadily unraveling. Authority was dispersed among competing centers of power, none of which could impose a lasting solution to the empire's problems. By the early 9th century, it was clear that the Tang dynasty had entered a phase of irreversible decline. The state no longer possessed the capacity to enforce uniform policy or ensure social stability across its vast territory. What remained was a delicate balance sustained by compromise, inertia, and the lingering memory of past greatness. This period did not produce a single dramatic collapse. Instead, it unfolded as a slow erosion of imperial coherence. Each concession to military governors, each intervention by eunuchs, and each failed reform chipped away at the foundations of the dynasty. The Tang endured, but it did so in a diminished form, increasingly dependent on forces beyond its control. The lessons of this era were stark. Survival in the aftermath of catastrophe required flexibility, but flexibility without authority bred fragmentation. The Tang dynasty had weathered rebellion, yet the price of survival was a permanent transformation of power relations. The empire moved forward, burdened by unresolved contradictions, setting the stage for the final upheavals that would eventually bring its long history to an end. By the late 9th century, the Tang dynasty existed in a state of prolonged exhaustion. Decades of political fragmentation, military autonomy, and court intrigue had drained the remaining strength from the imperial system. The emperor still sat on the throne in Chang'an, rituals were still observed, and official titles continued to circulate. Yet real power had slipped decisively into the hands of regional forces. What remained was no longer a unified empire, but a fragile structure held together by habit, memory, and fear of chaos. The countryside bore the heaviest burden of this decline. Years of heavy taxation, corrupt local administration, and repeated natural disasters pushed rural communities beyond endurance. Floods along major rivers destroyed harvests, while droughts turned fertile land into dust. For peasants already struggling to survive, the state appeared distant and indifferent. In many regions, officials were unable or unwilling to provide relief, reinforcing the perception that imperial authority had lost its moral purpose. Out of this desperation emerged large-scale popular uprisings. Among them, the rebellion led by Huang Chao proved the most destructive. Huang Chao was not a court insider or military governor, but a failed examination candidate who embodied the frustrations of those excluded from power and opportunity. His movement drew strength from dispossessed farmers, smugglers, and former soldiers, forming a massive force fueled by anger and survival instinct rather than ideological vision. Huang Chao's armies swept across large portions of the empire, overwhelming local defenses with sheer numbers. Cities fell, trade routes collapsed, and regional administrations disintegrated. In the year 880, his forces captured Chang'an itself. The imperial capital, once the heart of Tang authority and culture, was subjected to devastation. The emperor fled once again, repeating a pattern that had become tragically familiar since the Lushan rebellion. The capture of Chang'an by a peasant army symbolized the complete erosion of centralized control. Although Huang Chao ultimately failed to establish a lasting regime, his rebellion shattered what little stability remained. The Tang court was forced to rely on powerful military commanders to suppress the uprising, granting them even greater autonomy as the price of survival. Among these commanders was Zhu Wen, a former rebel who had defected to the Tang and risen rapidly through the ranks. His trajectory reflected the era's moral ambiguity, where loyalty was flexible and power flowed to those willing to seize it. Zhu Wen emerged as the most powerful figure in the collapsing empire. He commanded significant military forces and controlled key territories, positioning himself as the true arbiter of Tang politics. While nominally serving the dynasty, his actions increasingly served his own interests. He eliminated rivals, consolidated authority, and reduced the emperor to a symbolic figurehead. The court, long weakened by eunuch dominance, proved incapable of resisting his ascent. In the year 904, Zhu Wen orchestrated the assassination of Emperor Zhaozong, removing one of the last figures who might have challenged his control. The throne passed to a child, Emperor Ai, whose youth made him entirely dependent on Zhu Wen's protection. This arrangement stripped the Tang Dynasty of any remaining credibility as an independent governing force. The dynasty that had once ruled through strength and vision now survived only at the pleasure of a warlord. 3 years later, in the year 907, Zhu Wen took the final step. He forced Emperor Ai to abdicate and declared the founding of a new dynasty, later Liang. With this act, the Tang Dynasty formally came to an end after nearly 3 centuries of rule. There was no dramatic final battle, no unified resistance, and no widespread mourning. The dynasty collapsed quietly, its authority already gone long before its name was erased. The fall of the Tang did not bring immediate stability. Instead, it opened the door to the period known as the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms, an era of fragmentation marked by rapid regime changes and regional rivalry. Power shifted constantly among competing states, each claiming legitimacy while lacking the capacity to reunify the empire. The centralized imperial order that the Tang had once perfected would not be fully restored for decades. In retrospect, the end of the Tang Dynasty was not the result of a single failure, but of accumulated contradictions. The mechanisms that had once ensured stability, regional military authority, palace eunuchs, and flexible political alliances became sources of decay when left unchecked. Prosperity had bred complacency, crisis had forced compromise, and compromise had eroded authority. The dynasty survived its greatest rebellions, only to be undone by the long aftermath. Yet the legacy of the Tang endured far beyond its political collapse. Its cultural achievements, administrative innovations, and vision of a cosmopolitan empire continued to shape Chinese civilization for centuries. Later dynasties looked back to the Tang as a model of what imperial rule could achieve at its height, and as a warning of how easily that greatness could fade. The story of the Tang Dynasty is therefore not only one of rise and fall, but of balance and imbalance, discipline and indulgence, unity and fragmentation. It illustrates how power must be constantly renewed through effective governance and moral authority, not merely inherited or enforced. When those foundations weaken, even the most brilliant empire can slowly unravel. Thank you for staying with us through this journey across the rise, glory, and collapse of the Tang Dynasty. What do you think were the most important factors behind its downfall, and do you see parallels with other empires in history? Share your thoughts and leave a comment below.